So if you take a seat, if you haven't already taken a seat. Yes, Seth. All right, welcome to Pub Theology. We're keen to kick off tonight. We've got an awesome speaker. First, I just want to thank Dicey Riley's the pub for having us here. It's really awesome that they host us here every month, and Benny's Bistro, which does awesome work to feed all of our hungry mouths. So round of applause for them. Thank you, Tara. All right, cool. So tonight we are engaging with the topic of faith and reason with a man who has spoken on it many a times. I've heard him speak on it before, Mr. Jude Hennessy. Just a little bit of a bio on Jude Hennessy. So he taught RE, among other things, at as a teacher in high schools for about 20 years. He had a Bachelor of Arts, a Diploma of Education, but moving forward he went and got a Diploma of Catechetics and a Masters of Education in RE. So he's been studying religion for quite a while, but he's now moved out of teaching and he's the Director of Evangelization in the Diocese of Wollongong. So here to talk to us about faith and reason, specifically engaging graciously with unbelief, it's Mr. Jude Hennessy. Round of applause for Jude.
Thanks very much, Jono, and thanks very much for everyone for that welcome. And probably, regardless of all those inane qualifications, is a background and family history in pubs more than anything else. My dad loves to tell people that he was someone who attended about 15 different schools because his dad would buy a pub, a country pub usually, do it up, sell up and then move on. So they had country pubs all around New South Wales and Queensland, and lo and behold, in the end, Dad ended up as the youngest licensee in New South Wales many years ago, running a wine saloon in King's Cross back in the day, which he loves to tell people about. And I've got to be honest, the sort of stuff I want to talk about tonight I've heard spoken about so many times in my lounge room over plenty of beers with friends and neighbours and relatives. All have different opinions about God, faith, the mysterious, the miraculous and all that sort of stuff. So hopefully, I'm feeling pretty comfortable and sort of feel like, regardless of all those silly little degrees and things that Johnny just referred to, probably the most important thing I've done is sang in bands for 10 years in pubs and had plenty of beers with blokes afterwards who want to talk to you about faith when they scratch past the service and ask a few questions about who you are. And so in the spirit of that, just really conscious of the fact that we've probably got a whole lot of people here who come from an understanding and a level of faith where they're convinced and they just know that they know that they know, and a whole lot of other people who might be here as agnostics and just go, you know what, mate, I have no idea where I stand on all this sort of stuff, and I've moved in and out of faith, and there's lots and lots of questions that I have, and there might be people that are just adamant that, you know, this God stuff is a load of rubbish, and you are in dream world, champion. And I appreciate that, and I've got to say that, you know, even from the context of my own family and some of my best mates, right through uni and even within my own family now, would say, Jude, what are you talking about? And I guess tonight what I want to talk about is some of the key questions that people, after a few beers, or not after a few beers, just in moments of, I suppose, deep thought and conversation, questions that they've thrown at me about why I believe. So that's what I want to do for you tonight, and I hope we can do that fairly conversationally in a way that's non-threatening and pretty engaging for people. So anyway, we'll see how we go. That's the aim in any case. So that's what I'd like to do. I do want to explore some of the common challenges to belief of believers, and I'm going to try and do that by looking at just a few key questions, common questions. And there's so many questions. You could just go and create a massive list of all these sorts of things. But I've got about 9 key ones I just want to address tonight. The thing that's not going to be tonight, and I'm sorry if you're disappointed about it, I'm not going to give you a history of the drift that's happened between, you know, rationalism and faith, or religion and faith, or science and faith. I could, but it's pretty hard to do that in 45 minutes. And this little talk, I suppose, is a bit of a distilling down of a series of suppose, lectures and talks and questions that I answered for a bunch of students of mine from Year 9 to Year 12 over many, many years, but particularly with the advent of some of the really, I suppose, aggressive stuff that we started to see from the new atheists in the ooze from probably 2005 on, that really didn't want to enter so much into debate about belief versus non-belief, but just wanted to throw eggs from the sideline and really do it through ridicule, and didn't want to have an argument. So I don't want to do that tonight. Well, I can't do that tonight. I'd love to do it another time, but I do want to highlight some of the common questions that are there. You know, so there might be some people here, and there's plenty of people in my life and in my world who'd agree with that little caption that people with imaginary friends, and my imaginary friend just happens to be Jesus Christ, are stupid. And there'd be plenty of people who from many, many years ago, even when I was at school, would have had that opinion of me. And I've got to say, my name's Jude Augustine Peter Hennessy. If that doesn't strike a few bells with you, that you can imagine I was brought up in a fairly Catholic home. And I was brought up in a family that lived life to the full, and my old man's attitude to faith was, if you're going to share faith, then you better have a smile on your dial, and you better be genuinely joyful about what you believe, because if you don't, if that's not part of who you are and who you life, then just forget it. So and that was very much part of their lifestyle. I remember getting a tap on the shoulder in the tuck shop line when I was 17 years old, and I had the nickname in those days Father Jude. Not stealing your thunder there, Father Dwayne, but as a 17-year-old I had the nickname Father Jude because I used to take on guys in RE classes, and sometimes I'd take on teachers in RE classes, and so that was a name that sort of stuck. But I had this guy who I'd played footy with for years and years and years, and we were mates, and we'd we were friendly but not best of mates, and he tapped me on the shoulder and he said to me, it was a new school. We'd gone from Delar Caringbah to Delar Cronulla, so there were girls in the tuck shop line, which was a new experience for me straight away. And he's tapped me on the shoulder, turned around, and he's looked me in the face, seriously, and he's just gone, how come you believe in God so much? And he wasn't joking, and he wasn't picking a fight, and he had a look of desperation on his face, and I'm just going, what? I felt like saying, mate, can we talk about this later? Because I'm not ready for this, but the look on his face got me to a point of just saying, oh man, this guy wants an answer now. And it drove home to me that if you're going to live your faith and you believe this stuff, at some point in time someone's going to say, listen, what do you want about? And you better have something credible to say. And if you don't, it's pretty negligent. It's pretty negligent in the way that you're going about sharing your faith and your Christianity. And the best I could do with my 17-year-old version of Faith of Reason was, first of all, I've done it in my head. I've asked all the questions. I've done all the reading in relation to the scientific questions and creation and all the stuff associated with the questions that are being asked of science, of faith. I've done the reading of that, and it seems credible. But more to the point, and this is probably off limits for people who are atheistic, I've felt something. I've had an encounter. And those two sort of things are really critical in this whole process of talking to people about why you believe. Unfortunately, half of the argument often seems to be just out of the question as irrational garbage. But for people who've had that encounter, you just know. You just know. And for me, as someone I would regard as fairly rational, you just can't write that off as something which is just an experience you had when you were vulnerable or that you needed to have, you know. So he asked me why I believed all this God stuff, and I gave him the very best version I could of faith and reason. But then I said, mate, I'd love to talk to you about this some more, and did over the course of 6 weeks, Friday afternoons, just going somewhere and having a chat and breaking open a whole lot of stuff. And this guy was clever. He's big too. He's big and he was clever. But I know in the end he reached a point of engagement with a whole lot of the questions that he was asking, where his definite atheism, he reached the point of going, you're saying some stuff to me that I've never heard before and that I need to consider. But also in the end that he had a point of encounter. The other thing that you often encounter when you're talking about this sort of stuff is the fact that people like me, or some of you who believe, we're just simple-minded little fools who are vulnerable and need this as some sort of a crutch, or, it's our, as Marx would say, it's our opium. And that's such a simplistic criticism of believers that it shows almost a lack of wanting to engage with things. So I want to talk tonight about, I suppose, the reasonable sort of belief, for that matter, for those people who might not engage with that sort of stuff. But the warning for people like me, I think, comes from someone like C.S. Lewis, who absolutely was a full-on atheist, but reached a point of encounter. First of all, he did it in his head. He did it in his head and moved from this position of, that's rubbish, to, wow, there's something to this, wow, this is logical, this makes sense, and in the end surrendered his atheism to belief, to theism. I'm not going to say straight away to Christianity. He surrendered to theism, and then he moved to this point of encounter, and he writes this book, Surprised by Joy. But the warning to people like me, and I'm speaking to the people here who, like me, might want to engage graciously with unbelief, there's a big trap that you can often make. And that trap is that you can, as it says there on the slides, get so interested in proving the existence of God that they come to care nothing for God himself, as if the good Lord had nothing to do but exist. There have been some who got so preoccupied in spreading Christianity, or theism for that matter too, it occurs in other faiths, that they never give a thought to Christ. And yet, remember the reason for engaging with all this sort of stuff. It's as it says there, it's a dangerous, dangerous snare. If you're going to get so preoccupied with that stuff that you forget that this is stuff. Then in the end, comes down to a relationship. Often after you've done the stuff in your head. Often after you've gone through that process of moving towards belief. So remember the reason for engaging in these conversations, and that when you do, you need to have good answers when challenged about things about your faith. You need to realise that, faith and reason, and you need to have credible content to move towards an understanding that faith and reason are not enemies. But really, since the Enlightenment and the advent of rationalism, they've drifted further and further apart. And both sides are at fault in that. Both religion and science are at fault within that process. And religion's made some pretty big mistakes within the context of that. There's plenty of things we could list on both sides. But I believe that there is a slow movement in a sincere search for truth that has the possibility of bringing them back together. And I believe that because truth can't contradict truth. That's a philosophical statement, I know, but religion and science, realistically, they should be on a collision course if both religion and science are on that sincere search. The problem becomes when you get biased science or biased philosophy that already has a starting point that excludes God, or when you get dumb religion that wants to ignore what are the obvious discoveries and I suppose what I consider to be the elements of awe of science that get ignored, that keep them separate. And certainly the Catholic tradition that I come from, not just Christian, but the Catholic tradition that I come from is very, 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 very strong in pointing that out. There's been a whole lot of scientific developments and that are leading to this, I suppose, understanding that science, the more we're coming to know, the more that science is grasping for language which is almost religious. And that's not to suggest that science is looking for the God of the gaps that they accuse us of. There's a realisation in a whole lot of ways that the universe, from its most minuscule, from its smallest elements, from the most finite things, from the tiniest things to the biggest things of what we're discovering around us, is grasping for the infinite, is grasping for this language associated with the Creator. Now, I'm not saying that's associated with Christianity, but there are lots and lots of scientists that are moving towards this I suppose, grasping for God. My old mate there, sticking his tongue out at us, would say this: there exists between religion and science strong relationships and dependencies. Science without religion is lame. I firmly believe that. But at the same time too, religion without science is blind. You can dumb this stuff down. And I'm very concerned about fundamentalists of any faith that try and do that and exclude the things that are glorious in the discoveries that we're finding about our world. This also concerns me. The fact that people like me, and many of you, don't get a fair crack And even I'd struggle to put the goal in with that sort of a wall. But the reality is that for so many people of belief, particularly people of belief who are credible within institutions and scientific, are encountering this growing intolerance because of their faith. And it seems like a free kick at religion, in particular Christianity, is just, that's quite acceptable. That's quite acceptable within society. And it's interesting how that's evolved. It's another talk altogether. And I'd suggest you strongly that there be an outcry about any other sort of behaviour that singled that out. My old man again describes this sort of stuff as the new martyrdom. You don't have to kill someone and martyr them these days. You see it very much in so much of the mainstream media, and I do in particular with some of the stuff that I've got to answer to media within my role, where you just can't get a fair crack at getting your point of view across, but seemingly the other side absolutely does. There's an arrogant dismissiveness sometimes of people of faith that... Well, without putting any barriers on it, it's often quite arrogant. It's often through ridicule and derision and character assassination. And I love nothing more, and I love some of my atheist mates. But the best thing about the sort of conversations we have is that we love each other, and we have conversations that are not full of ridicule, that they're actually full of people sincerely searching for truth. There's a big difference. That's humanity, you know. That's we're all on that search. The other thing that you often see, and increasingly so, and you see it in the writings of a lot of the new atheists, is that you just, and some of them will say it quite adamantly, is just if you get people with faith, just dismiss them, ridicule them, bring them down, humiliate them. And I know for myself, particularly as a guy, you don't have to... Sorry, mate. Yep. Yeah, I love you too, man. Yeah, that's cool. Well, when I get to there, man, no, it's all right. No, mate, I had a chat to you last time we were here. I think I had a chat to you last time we were here. I'm really happy to have a chat to you at the end of it. It's all good, buddy. It's all good. And you may be, mate, you may be one of these guys that I'm talking about who you know you can have conversations with them and they're going to debate you really, I suppose, in a proper manner. But the sort of stuff we're seeing with a whole lot of guys, particularly Dawkins and co, is this arrogant dismissiveness. And they, I suppose, make a joke of and dismiss people in this sort of stuff. It was really interesting in 2010 when they had the Atheist Convention in Australia, and it was a couple of years after a thing called World Youth Day, that Richard Dawkins came out here, and there was a big celebration because they almost got 1,000 people to go to a convention centre in Melbourne to talk about atheism, which was, you know, it was big news on a whole lot of stuff in the media. It was interesting what Jewish author Melanie Phillips said at the time. She said, Richard Dawkins, the high priest of atheism, high priest in unbelief, said he's made a career out of telling everyone how much more tolerant religion would be if only religion were obliterated. It was, in many ways, it was a really telling comment within the whole context of that, and there was such celebration that there was almost 1,000 people who went to this conference. And yet I remember reading just 2 years earlier, after a celebration of World Youth Day at Randwick, where there'd been 980,000 people, about how much disappointment there must be within the Christian church, within the Catholic church in particular, that they didn't hit 1 million people. What does the church say about all this sort of stuff? And Benedict XVI has been really clear and quite critical of religion in many ways too, when he said that reason without faith becomes scepticism, cynicism, and ultimately nihilism. And there's this, you know, real loss of hope associated with that. And he said faith without reason, on the other hand, becomes fundamentalism, extremism, and sometimes violence. And we see that too. The extremes in both, and particularly extremes in religion, they're very, very dangerous too, and give no credibility to faith and people of faith. And so he'd say to us that we need to avoid arrogant science, and at the same time we need to avoid dumb religion. That's if I want to distill down all the stuff that he's sort of saying about faith and reason. He's very, very clear in saying to us that faith and reason need one another, and that's very different to the attitude of many of the new atheists. There doesn't seem to be any concept that there might be common ground. This guy, thumbs up, and he's very popular around the world. with atheists and Christians and non-Christians alike is Pope Francis. And Benedict, I just finished what he said there. He was a glass half full man. He said we need to have something really positive to say. And Pope Francis said too, in the context of faith and belief, that we need to be joyful and we need to be confident that what we've got to say is going to be life-giving. It's really going to be life-giving to people. And that's often what we might consider to be the proof of the pudding. Okay. Cutting to the chase and all this sort of stuff. I thought I'd move to what I consider to be the sort of questions that I know that, a whole lot of blokes, mates and guys that are acquaintances would ask me in regard to key questions about, mate, how can you believe this stuff? And there's so many more I could get to, but again, that would mean a lot more time than we've got tonight, and it'll probably continue over a few more beers later on with a few people, but I'll try and address these as best I can. And where's Jono? Jono, you're going to have to keep tapping your watch, mate, because I can probably just go on and on about all this sort of stuff. First thing I want to address is a question you get thrown at you a whole lot of times, which is, if there's enough time, then life would appear somewhere. We don't need God. If there's enough time and we've got a big enough universe in particular. The second question or comment or statement that I just allude to is the fact that God's for weak people who need a crutch to hang on to because they're afraid of living and dying. This notion of, hey, just get on with it, mate. Some people would say to you, and I've encountered it lots and lots of times, but good people, but they just say, listen, mate, you're hanging on to superstition, religion's going to die out. It's a matter of time. Science will replace religion completely. Other people would question, and I've just written down the Bible there because that's the language they use, but you could extend that into a whole lot of areas of revelation. There's this notion of prayerful revelation as well. How can you take the Bible or revelation from God seriously? Have you read Genesis? It's wrong. And Genesis always seems to be that critical starting point where people want to go back to, and quite rightly too, because there's lots and lots of Christian churches, I'd say, just got it so wrong in the way that they want to read and interpret Genesis. How can you believe in God? Haven't you heard of evolution? And people try and debunk your faith based on some understanding about how the Creator created. And I'll talk to that shortly as well. How can you believe in the God? We know the Big Bang caused everything. And I'm just going through a list of things that I've encountered. These have been the most common ones. This is often not trying to disprove God, but just trying to say, listen, mate, your religion is, if you want to put it in the language of some of the new atheists, they'd say religion poisons everything. Religion poisons everything. How could you be part of something which is part of all this sort of stuff? Division, war, bigotry, etc., etc. And this is a good one, and I get this, and it's probably, I reckon, the best question that people of non-belief have got, and it's a tough one to answer, but I believe the credible answers that the people of faith have got are worth listening to on this sort of stuff. It's essentially in relation to questions about pain and suffering. I can't believe in God, not since my little brother died. I've thrown that down as one example. And I've had those sort of conversations with lots of people that are hurting, would say, man, you talk about a loving God, this happened, how could that possibly equate to anything in this universe which is a loving God who gives a damn about any of us, And then the final one often is in relation to, and this could be a whole category of things, questions about or an unwillingness to talk with, I suppose, any substance about the notion of mystery. And a total removal of that from any element of the debate, and in particular the stuff, and I'll talk about the Catholic experience of the miraculous as we get into that. So. All right, so I just want to go through these as quickly as I can, but hopefully not gloss over them so that everyone goes, oh, wow, I didn't get any of that. And look, if you see me at the end of this and you want to get copies of this sort of stuff and send off emails and pick fights with me, that's okay. I'd be happy to do that as long as you give me a cuddle before we go. All right. So if there's enough time, then life will appear somewhere. We don't need God. That's a very common question that we get. And to that I'd say that's not necessarily what that is coming out of what the known universe and discoveries in the known universe is telling us. Put it simply, and again, this would be something you could do a whole series of lectures on. There hasn't been enough time based on the age of the universe, and the universe is not big enough or old enough for the life that we consider to be Jude, Hennessy, or any of you to have appeared randomly and by chance. And that's not me saying that. We're talking about atheistic mathematicians who've done the sums repeatedly over and over again, and for many of them it's just rocked them. it's rocked them in terms of their understanding about how this, let alone just one strand of DNA, but this and rational thought and everything else has developed in this sort of a universe that we inhabit, you know. And there's this growing understanding that these probabilities can't be considered anything but ridiculous, you know. Now that, I admit, doesn't move straight away to a belief in God. It certainly doesn't move straight away to a belief in Christianity, but it's moving many to a belief in theism, to an understanding and in engaging with the prospect of theism. As I said to you, the odds there are essentially zero and all that sort of stuff, you know. Okay. Second question, and I'm saying this, I suppose, in the context and understanding that many of you guys would have these conversations too. Perhaps it's in a coffee shop at uni, perhaps it's like you with family members, like me with family members, or people that, you know, you engage with just in day-to-day life. And so I'm just trying to say, well, what would you say? And here's some of the things that, you know, that I've thought about saying from time to time. Okay, God's for weak people. They need a crutch to hang on to because they're afraid of living, and often associate that with afraid of death too. To that I'd say that's not a logical statement, particularly when you look at the evidence and the way that people of faith live their lives, you know. I have no doubt that it's caused people to question their faith, and many people probably to move away from their faith, going, well, I don't want to appear weak and feeble and you know, a bit dim. And I have no doubt too that some people have moved away from faith uncritically because they want to appear strong and brave, and I don't need that faith stuff too, you know. I'd say to that there's weak believers just as there's weak atheists, as in everything, just as in fact too, there's really respectful, really well-considered atheists, and there's really respectful, well-considered Christians, but there's others too who've just got no idea. They're just nominal Christians, nominal theists, nominal atheists, who, when you scratch the surface, really haven't got a great understanding of and grasp of why they believe those things they do too. I'd say to you, could argue the opposite is true in that statement, particularly in the Western world, because belief is increasingly becoming so countercultural. You're going out on a limb. You're really taking the massive risk of looking like a complete mug. And that's very threatening for a lot of people, you know. And so I'd suggest you do that's the opposite of weakness. Some people might call it stupidity, but it is the opposite of weakness. Okay. I'd also suggest you too, from the Christian context, that living as the gospel really asks it to is not for the faint-hearted, by no stretch of the imagination. It is a radical life choice. And you know, I guess we'd say too that there's a whole lot of weakness within each of us that is made strong through what we consider to be an encounter with the Spirit. And we refer to that as the Holy Spirit. But again, that's difficult to engage someone in that conversation from an atheistic bent, because they just go, well, what are you talking about? That's off limits, mate. Certainly those who truly embrace the gospel and their relationship with Jesus, and I'd say within other faith traditions too. You look at anyone who really embraced the many wonderful faith traditions around the world, they do incredible things that go beyond the call of what you'd expect to be part of ordinary human responses to difficult, tragic, sad events, and in terms of the way that they give of themselves to others, you know. And that's not to say that atheists don't do that too. There's some fantastic, very humanitarian atheists in the context of our society and world too. I'd say that believers are not afraid to live, and more to the point, there's not this fear of dying either, which is a little bit scary when you start talking about radicals. You know, if I walked out in the prospect of getting hit by a bus as I crossed the road, there's a sense of assurity of what you're entering into, and for myself, I'm entering into the embrace of love. That's an embrace of love and encounter here that I'm going to, and again, that's a little bit off limits, all this sort of stuff, but that is our source of joy and hope. Given those sort of things, it's a cheap shot in many ways to say that people of belief are weak, because that's not what the evidence, when you look at the way people live, is telling us. You know, and good atheists would admit to that, and they go, I don't get it. Why do people do that sort of stuff, you know? Religion will die out in a few generations. Science will replace religion completely. To that I'd say that's nonsensical from the point of view that human existence is so dynamically tied to what we consider to be the spiritual. Even if you're not looking at traditional organised religion, there's a hunger and a thirst for that which we consider to be spiritual. Organised religion has great authority, and in many ways it has great elements of its tradition which draw people into a fullness of life. And I probably suppose the best proof for that sort of stuff is the fact that when you look at scales of happiness and fulfillment and all that sort of stuff, people of faith, and I'm not talking about Christianity here, I'm talking about people of faith, just seem to be doing better when they score and rate that sort of stuff. And that's putting aside all of the inferences of, oh, well, they've just got a positive attitude and outlook on life. No, there's more to it than that, you know. The other thing I'd say to that too is the fact that if you go back and look at the lists of the top 20 scientists and people of deep thought, and even in philosophy, over a long period of time, you find repeatedly people of faith and belief that are part of that group. And I've just put down one figure there. You know, the fact that in the top 20 scientists of history, regularly, you know, if you do a survey of that, it regularly includes about 15 theists, 10 of whom are Christian, 5 from other traditions. And it suggests that these are some of the preeminent thinkers of world history. And it's not through historical coincidence that they've come to that belief. That was very, very firmly a part of their scientific endeavour and their expectation that you could do science because there was a lawgiver. And the whole basis of being able to do scientific endeavour was extending from their understanding that there is a lawgiver who is consistent in all this sort of stuff, you know. Many former scientific atheists are returning to faith, and that's cool. There's plenty that are drifting away too, but there seems to be almost a bit of a slowing and a realisation that the more we discover, the more we do the maths, the more we do the physics, the more we look at the unbelievable nature of what we find in the universe, the more religion, the more science is grasping for the sort of language, and you see it used sometimes, that some of the great mystics of the world's tradition have used in the past. And I think that's a beautiful thing. It certainly is a sign to me of the fact that those guys, along with the mystics, were both in search for that same sincere truth, you know. Okay. And I've already said the fact that maths, and I wish I could pull out all the things that are part of the mathematical, I suppose, breakdown of the probabilities of not only life appearing on Earth, not only of the conditions for life, but the most basic forms of life, and then us appearing. It is improbable. I'll move on. I could keep going and going on this sort of stuff. The next is in reference to stuff in regard to the Bible or Revelation. And you'd have plenty of people say, mate, how can you take that stuff seriously? Have you seen Genesis? It's wrong. And it just reeks, that sort of a comment just reeks of what I'd have to explain and describe as a misunderstanding of what Scripture is. And certainly no understanding at all of the fact that Scripture is written in a whole lot of different genres and forms that we see to be inspired, definitely, and that have truth and essence and definitely God's revealing of God's self to humanity with human authorship. It contains religious truth. It's never meant to contain scientific truth, but it's interesting how the correlations between the two are remaining very, very much in sync. So this notion of Biblia and the Bible, is having an understanding of the way that these things were written by ancient people in an understanding of the nature of their relationship with God, you know, and you've got to understand all those different those forms, particularly that of Genesis, which is so deep and rich in explaining one version of creation, if you like, but more to the point, describing human desire to almost in a way be free of and arrogantly dismiss God, and what that leads to for us. And we could say, well, that's a danger for a scientific endeavour that wants to, as a starting point, exclude God. Certainly taking snippets of Scripture, as many Christians do, and they do great damage. It's dumbing religion down. And more to the point, I'd say too that I've seen atheists like Dawkins do exactly the same. Go and grab one line out of Scripture and try and suggest that this presents a certain argument and a certain strain of thought that disproves the existence of God and proves our point. True Christians understand that Scriptures are a history of God's revelation. This is what I'd be saying to people who question this or make comments of derision about scriptural revelation, and that over time God revealed himself to humanity when humanity was ready for it. And the whole story from Genesis right through to Revelation, and particularly with Christ in the Christian tradition, is this journeying back to God. Journeying away, God come back saying, hey, you need me, don't you? And drawing us back into God's embrace, Essentially, you need to communicate to people. And Genesis is not a science book. It's a story that essentially describes our desire to live without God, to arrogantly desire to possess all knowledge and all that sort of stuff. There's this notion of the tree of knowledge. Not that there's anything wrong with knowledge, but it was knowledge to say so that you can be God. You can be God, and you can dismiss any need for that which is the author of all things, Could probably write a similar story of what you see in Genesis to what we're seeing with some atheistic science. Mind you, there's lots and lots of fantastic scientists who are writing quite openly about the need for awe and recognition of the mysterious. And that's not making a God of the gaps. That's making a God who is the glue that's holding all this sort of stuff together. It's a source of awe, Another question often relates to these questions about evolution. I've had so many people go, oh, mate, haven't you heard of evolution? They're like, there's no need for God. Which is, I understand that, and people take sound bites all over and just go, well, that's the truth. And my response to that always is, yeah, of course I've heard of evolution. I embrace it, absolutely I do. But this notion that this has occurred by chance is ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. As I've said before, there's not enough space and certainly not enough time for that life to have risen, and even in its most simplest forms. Honest scientists know this. And people that have studied in any detail this notion of Darwin's theory also know that he pinched it. And he pinched it from someone who was very much in the Christian tradition, who was saying, this is amazing, and you can see God's finger and hand and all this sort of stuff throughout. And if you doubt that, go and read some stuff by a guy called Patrick Madrid, who absolutely shows the evolution of evolution. And in doing so, describes very much how it was hijacked with an atheist endeavour. Okay, it was trying to move it back to a preconceived starting point, The other thing I'd say too, when you have questions about, well, if there hasn't been enough time and enough space, is this notion that some scientists then propose, if the universe isn't big enough and it's not old enough for what we are now encountering, what we see at this one place within the universe, then there must be more than one universe. And so they've derived this concept of, what you describe as a multiverse. Good on them. That's great to have those sort of thoughts and to have those considerations. That's how you move endeavour on. That's how you move thought on. But to move to that, and I'll read from what we've got there, to move to a multiverse for which there's no evidence, rather than have one God, a God they increasingly need, not a God of the gaps, but the glue of creation, you've got to start to ask the question, then listen, who's embracing blind faith there? And I'd say that in that it's not me. I've only got 5 to go. I'm in strife, Pete. I am absolutely in strife. Okay. Then I'm going to move through that stuff on evolution. I'm going to move to this one because this is probably the most common one I've copped after doing a gig or having a beer or being at a party with someone. I want to say, mate, how do you believe in that religion rubbish? Don't you know it poisons everything? It's the source of division, war, bigotry. How can you possibly believe in something like that? And they're in many ways right. Do you mean to tell me that I've now got 10 minutes? Does that mean in 5 minutes I'm going to have 15 minutes and I'm going to be up here forever? I think that's going to be a wormhole, Pete. That's not good. That's a common cheap shot, that sort of a statement, and repeating it often doesn't make it true. There are some elements to truth of that, and it's undeniable that religious people have been associated with all of these things. And there's nothing worse than a religious fundamentalist, and the worst kind of people are people of religion who don't really truly embrace what their religion teaches, And in doing so, I'd say that they're rejecting this gospel of love, or they're rejecting the teachings of Buddha, or the true teachings of what they'd encounter within a whole variety of faith traditions within the world. But to claim that religion is the root cause of that is not fair. It's certainly not true. In fact, I'd go so far as to say the opposite is true. Christianity, undoubtedly, has been the greatest force for good in our world, if you can use the word good with any credibility. And I believe that only people of faith can use the word good with any credibility, because good and evil become absolutely just relativistic ideas of your own opinion of what's good and evil, unless you've got some notion of a lawgiver. It directs the hearts and desires for peace of all people of goodwill, absolutely. And religions and people of faith have done more to be sources of unity, peace and understanding than I would claim that any atheistic regime. Where we've got it wrong, we've often apologised, and we have. And you can look back historically at a whole lot of things that religious people and religious groups and faiths have done. But in the instances of those, you can also point back and say, you know what? And they weren't sticking to what you would say that the notion of deity had revealed to them as the way to live and the way to interact with people of faith. We're still waiting an apology from the atheists of the 20th century and the carnage that occurred as part of that historical period, and that's continuing to occur. Still waiting for an apology for the many things that have come about through such things as Nazism, communism, materialism. I suppose you could talk about relativism within those frames too. Certainly the notion of the survival of the fittest, which is an atheistic understanding, which doesn't bring God into the picture at all, of an understanding of creation. Those atheistic philosophies have wreaked havoc, and we're still awaiting the apology there. And in response to that, I'd say the ones often picking up the pieces are churches and people from a variety of faith traditions who do more than all the combined efforts of governments in the United Nations around the world to fix what are the results of injustices, and I suppose the hatred that stems from often people of, well, non-belief, but also people of belief who just don't get it and are hypocritical in the way that they live it. And I hope you understand that I'm being very, very pointed in both condemning people of faith who don't live it out and people of non-faith who, I guess you'd have to say, follow atheism in many ways to its logical conclusions. I'm going to skip over this one. It will be very similar to the sort of stuff that you'd see within stuff that I've just mentioned about evolution or in relation to Genesis and all that sort of stuff. But this notion of Big Bang Theory, I look at it and I look at all the documentaries and I read all the books, and it just leaves me in the same position that I am after a period of intense prayer, which is a position of awe. And remember too that it was the Judeo-Christian tradition many, many thousands of years before science took on the notion of something created from nothing, ex nihilo, who embraced this notion of, in the beginning, there was nothing, and then because God spoke, there was something. And scientists recognise too that within that notion of let there be light, those simple words, there is what we're discovering, a great intertwining and alignment with the things that we're discovering within science. And it's interesting too how the chronological order of things listed in Genesis, in many ways ridiculously like the order of things that we're seeing within scientific discovery of what must have been the order and the processes associated with this. Why? Well, for Jude Hennessy, it's because truth won't contradict truth in all these things. I'll move on. Again, we could talk ad infinitum about this notion and the movement towards a first cause. And some, I've spoken about multiverses already. I guess I'm saying that the pointers that we're getting from science are very much aligning themselves with the mystical sort of stuff and the mysterious stuff that people of faith align themselves with, but they also align themselves with science. I'm going to move on from that, and I want to talk about this understanding of pain. And Pete, I might pull the pin after that. I'll probably need to. And the number of times I've spoken to people that are hurting, and friends and family, and something bad's happened, whether it's a death in the family or whether it's a disease or whether it's a car, have happened within my own family. I've asked the same questions, and my father-in-law got cleaned up by a young bloke as he was walking across a crossing, and he ended up in a coma and died 12 months later. I'm going, what's going on? It asks some big questions when bad things happen to good people and when pain's part of it. And my response to that is always sorry. It's always empathy. We're made to love, and it hurts when people die. It does. In fact, it actually doesn't make a whole lot of sense why we hurt so much when all that sort of stuff happens. The other thing that I always then move to is the fact that, look, death's part of the gig, we're all going to move towards this engagement with death at some point in time. It's the only thing you're assured of when you're born, is that it's going to... And oftentimes too, there's pain associated with that sort of stuff, you know. So that's, you know, cutting to the chase. Well, I've had many conversations. I'm sure plenty of you guys have too, with people in your own way about this sort of stuff. And when you talk to people about where God's in the picture with all that sort of stuff, you're always trying to allude to the fact that our universe is subject to death and decay, absolutely, and we're part of this natural order in so many ways. We shouldn't be fearful or angry of it, and we shouldn't turn away from God. And in many ways too, we've got to recognise that God enters into that hurt and that brokenness and that pain and journeys with us. You know, I often think of that notion of the prayer footprints, which many of you would know, and even people that aren't of belief would have seen that on plenty of kitchen walls, that God enters into that experience with us. In fact, enters into it so profoundly himself in the person of Jesus Christ too. God allows it. He doesn't like it. He doesn't cause it, but he allows it. And it's part of the human condition, and there's so much more than meets the eye than the simple explanations that I think we get from so many traditions in this. But death and pain remains a source of mystery for us. Yet we remain, I'd certainly remain, in an understanding that God's in control of all this. It's worthwhile from time to time to take a step back from these sort of things and recognise that we're spiritual beings having a human experience, and that, you know, whether a person dies violently through accident, disease, or safely in their bed, from my perspective and from the experience of so many people across faith traditions and the truths of that, God's at the end of this line to meet us. Again, that's often off limits, that sort of a discussion. But it's still worth talking about, because your encounter and your experience and your prayerfulness and your spirituality, at some point in time, you have to bring into this. The other thing I like to say from this, in I suppose in some sort of a defence of God in relation to all this sort of stuff, is that pain can be purposeful. Certainly that's something that's part of the Catholic tradition. It's not part of many Protestant, born-again Pentecostal traditions that want to say, no, that's not part of God's plan at all. But God can work through any of the things that occur within our lives. And there's this amazing illustration which I came across 3 years ago, which I just think in a very simple story, and I'm not trying to be trite about it in any stretch of the imagination. It's in relation to this, and some of you have heard me speak about this condition called congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis. It's a really rare medical condition, but I heard about it going, oh wow, that speaks such a profound truth to us about whether or not pain has a purpose, you know. And kids that have got this condition rarely live past the age of about 7, and the reason that is because they have no understanding with or grasping of pain. They can scratch their eye until their cornea's hanging out. They can run at that wall over there and hit it 1,000,000 times with broken bones, and they'll just keep on going, and they can do incredible. They can put their hand on a hot plate and they're just looking at the smoke, and it's an incredible. Well, imagine being a parent encountering all that sort of stuff, and it's interesting when you talk to these parents with SEPA, they have one wish, that their children will feel pain so they'll stop hurting themselves. They'll feel pain so they stop hurting themselves, and in many instances, they'll stop hurting each other. And in some really weird, convoluted way, that's not meant to be, but I'm trying to give some sort of an explanation of this understanding that sin and pain is part of our existence, and it's really hard to explain. But that explanation is better than the dark explanation that nothing matters, and this sort of stuff is just something, there is meaning associated with this sort of stuff. I'd love to go in and talk to you about the miraculous. I really would. And I'll just say this. After the Reformation, there was only one church that effectively believed in the miraculous, and that was the Catholic Church, and most churches wrote it off until the Pentecostal revival of the beginning of the 20th century. And the Catholic Church was criticised for a long, long time by not only atheists and agnostics, but the rest of the Christian world, and saying that's just your superstition and you're just trying to hoodwink people by this notion of the miraculous. But the thing they didn't understand within all of this, the church was harder on itself in trying to disprove all this sort of stuff, so that it didn't lose credibility if they did say, listen, that's something that we're defining as miraculous, because you get one that we get wrong and you can just say all the other are discredited. It's almost like contempt of court. You just go, remember that one they got wrong? You can write them all off. And that's why the Catholic Church has always been really, really quite clear and very, very deliberate. That notion of the Inquisition, the office of the Inquisition, as it was back in the bad old days and what it's called now, had that job of categorically disproving those things which were miraculous, and to shoot down the miracles of God linked to history. And yet, when you look at the modern miracles of the Church, and the rigorous independent testing that this sort of stuff's gone, not only do they defy belief, but they defy unbelief. And I say that quite seriously. But, I could talk about such things as the incorruptibles. If you know what I'm talking about, write it down and go and look up the incorruptibles or Eucharistic miracles, healings, all that sort of stuff. I guarantee you, the Catholic Church has been harder on itself in trying to disprove those things because they don't want to be discredited about it than any atheist has been, and usually bring people like that into the picture to try and be part of it. I think Albert Einstein was right when he said there's only two ways to live your life. One is though nothing's miraculous. That's dumb. The other is though everything is a miracle. That's just as dumb. All right. For some though, no proof is necessary. And we get that great relation to St. Thomas, been doubting Thomas. I'm not going to believe until I put my finger into the holes in his hands and his side. If you don't know the scripture verse, that was St. Thomas. And people think, I reckon he's been criticised for that. No, good on you. In many ways, he was saying, no, I want to believe, but just let me see the evidence. And I firmly believe that you explore the evidence for a whole lot of things within faith, you end up coming back to some sort of a sense of credibility. So for some, no proof is necessary. But at the same time, too, for some, because of closed-mindedness, no proof is possible. The other thing I'd say in leaving this point is that, and this has got in relation to this understanding of free will, we can't have a God who overwhelms us to the point where we must believe. And so many of the great philosophers would say, look, God's put enough of himself, just enough of himself into the world to make faith necessary, but left enough of God's self out. I think I said that wrong. God's put enough of himself in the world to make belief reasonable, but left enough out to make faith necessary. And the logical movement away from that is that if God overwhelmed us with the entirety and the complexity and the infiniteness of his being, there's no choice. We almost become robotic in this understanding of movement towards God. And yet a loving God, and love never overwhelms, love never dominates, love provides with free will and gives that choice of acceptance of God or non-acceptance of God. There's so much more theologically associated with that sort of stuff. Pete, do I need to shut up or can I finish with this? I'd say to people who question faith, I'd just go, if faith is so bad, then how come these things seem to be so true? And I'm not just talking about Christianity again, I'm talking about people who experience faith in a whole lot of traditions. How come faith's good for you? And I question how doctrine, which is just trying to impart truth, religious truth, which I think goes in hand with scientific truth, how did it become such a dirty word if faith leads to lower rates of serious illness? So many studies right around the world, Western world and in the developing world show that. You have better mental health, better well-being, lower rates of dependency, addiction, higher rates of much better self-esteem and all that sort of stuff. And of individuals who know their worth, they're less likely to be in relationships of exploitation when they have an understanding of who they are, not only in relation to others, but in relation to this loving God who's created them as sacred, sanctified human beings. It creates critical thinkers. People of faith, they're not dummies. Generally, there's plenty of people who have simple faith, but you look at people of faith, there's so many of them around the world who generally, they're highly educated. People of faith generally are people who have reached a level of education and inquiry, particularly in the Western world. They're often in really good relationships, committed and loving. This is one that surprises. Religion doesn't destroy sex, because when you do surveys of people who have encountered God, they always score more highly when they're asked questions about, hey, how's your love life? They're killing it. Again, in relation to their understanding of who they are and what its purpose is in the eyes of God, They're very strongly trying to get the suggestion that it's the other way around. It ain't. High rates of goal achievement, career success, often earnings. Well, it is in earnings. All those sort of things. And so often in relation to that sort of stuff, I'd say to atheists, if that's the case, it doesn't make sense. But it does make sense if you do take my middle namesake's reference to the fact that we're made for thee and thee alone, O God, and our heart won't rest until that rests in thee. If that's true, then that makes sense. That makes sense as we move to that sort of a grasp. John, you're going to throw something at me to make me stop, aren't you? I'm going to stop. I could have gone through all this other stuff, and then no one would buy me a beer. No one would buy me a beer. I did want to get onto the stuff of talking about the notion of right and wrong and good and evil and all that sort of stuff. There you go. Thank you. Thank you for listening.